Hi everyone, my name is Mike Cook, and this is a paper presentation that I gave at the International Conference on Computational Creativity in Salamanca in Spain. It's another hotel room recording, I'm afraid, but I wanted to make sure that I had a version of the talk ready around the time that I actually gave the talk in real life so I could put it up on YouTube. In terms of content, this talk delves kind of deep into computational creativity theory, I would say. But it's still pretty accessible. Even if you don't work in the field, I think you'll probably enjoy it. And if you want to find out kind of what I'm thinking about for Angelina for the future, it's a good talk for that. So the title was Redesigning Computationally Creative Systems for Continuous Creation, which is kind of a long-winded way of talking about these three things. So I'm going to be talking about how I redesigned Angelina, which is my automated video game design system. I'm going to propose a new aspect of computationally creative systems. So we already have these concepts called product and process, which I'll talk about later. And I'm going to introduce this third idea, which I think should be included alongside those. And I'm also going to talk about continuous creativity and building a system that is continuously creative, and how this has changed how I think about building these systems in general. So, if you don't know what Angelina is, it was my PhD research project. It's a piece of software that designs games on its own. So when we started off, the kinds of games it designed were very abstract. They looked like this. They were kind of colored dots moving around with rules that governed what would happen when they bumped into each other. And it was very basic, it was very abstract. And then as time went on, we kind of made things more sophisticated. We built systems like this. This one read the Guardian newspaper every day, and then it would pick a news article to make a game about. So it would design a platform game, but then it would pick music and images and arrange them with other details like sound effects to try and convey the news story it was reading. So very simple computational creativity ideas of mixing in and evaluating, I guess, real-world events and concepts. And then after that, towards the end of my PhD, I built this version of Angelina, which was a bit more ambitious. It was in 3D, and there were a lot of new problems to solve there. And one of the neat things about this was that I really focused on Angelina interpreting much simpler pictures. So instead of reading a whole newspaper article and using that to design a simple platform game, this time Angelina could take just a single word or maybe a phrase or a sentence, and it would try and expand that and build a game around this. And this allowed us to actually enter a game jam for the first time, which is kind of a creativity contest that game developers enter into. So this was a really big moment for the PhD, and that was kind of the last time anyone saw serious output from Angelina, which was a couple of years ago now. So the structure of Angelina, the structure of those versions of the systems had worked like this. There were kind of three stages. The first stage was what we called pre-design. So pre-design was anything before game design actually happened, as the name suggests. So that was things like reading newspaper articles, going online to analyze phrases or words, searching for media, and gathering everything that Angelina would need to actually design the game. The system would do this. Then there was the main design phase, and for this we used something called cooperative coevolution. And the way that works is it's several separate evolutionary systems. So an evolutionary system is a generative process that can make something, and we had several of them working together in parallel, which was a little bit unusual. They were all kind of wired together like a big jumbled circuit board. And what that meant was that the part of Angelina that was designing levels was always getting information from the part that was designing rules, or the part that was doing artistic arrangements, that kind of thing. And my idea was that because they were all connected, this would allow these systems to solve the problem simultaneously, so it would be very fast, but they would also be able to influence one another. And that was kind of the core of my thesis. And then after the design phase was kind of cleanup, so we would do things like, obviously Angelina would have to compile the game and export it to the web, and most importantly it would write commentaries. So these were bits of text that explained what the system had done. And this is something we call framing in computational creativity, and it's really important. It really helps people engage more with the system. And then that was it. So there were kind of three stages with this big parallel chunk in the middle. Now I could talk about good things we did, but that's much less interesting than talking about what was wrong with the system, because that's what motivated this work. So there were four major problems that I want to talk about today. One was that it was just a hard system to build. It was a hard system to engineer, and we don't talk about that very often in computational creativity, I think. But some of the decisions I'd made this system hard to extend, hard to maintain. And one of the reasons why there were 5 or 6 different versions of Angelina during my PhD, obviously one reason was that I wanted to try different things, but another was that it was really hard to avoid starting over again because of the way these systems were built. They were very brittle. So I really wanted to get over that. Another problem that the system had was that its design process was actually entirely opaque. So this thing I've just described to you, this way of making games, Angelina didn't actually work like this. You couldn't see any of this. The only thing that you could see was the games that it made at the end. And that's a problem if I'm asking you to believe that this system is creative, because you're unable to tell which bits Angelina has done. So parts of the game were coded by me, parts of the games were responsible, like the game engine was in control of them, and parts of the game were designed by Angelina. And it was really hard for people to appreciate what Angelina had done because they couldn't see it. So that was another big problem. And there were kind of thornier problems than that, more philosophical ones. So one of the problems was that the system kind of had limited reach. It had limited control over its own destiny, I guess. So Angelina just made games. That was the only thing it did. And it only made games when I told it to. There was no meaning to its existence besides this. It didn't have any impact on the world. The world never had any impact on it, really. And that made it kind of harder to believe that the system was independently creative, because there was nothing independent about it. And finally, it was really hard to mix in other creative acts. So I've just shown you the setup for our system with these 3 phases. And these phases are kind of closed off, and they would all happen one after another over the space of kind of 4 to 6 hours. And so during my PhD, I built other systems. So I built this system which I really loved called Mechanic Minor. And Mechanic Minor would invent game mechanics. So if you think in Mario, when you press the jump button, Mario goes up in the air, for instance, or when you land on an enemy, the enemy squishes and dies. These are little chunks of gameplay or a game process that the word mechanic has lots of definitions, but let's go with that one for now. And I really like this, and I wanted Angelina to design game mechanics as well. But it was really hard to figure out where that fit in. Like, should it design a game mechanic every time it makes a game? Should it remember them? Like, where would it do them? Like, where does it fit into Angelina's 6-hour game design process? How do you factor in different levels of creativity? If you want Angelina to just use ideas it already knows about, or maybe you wanted to think very hard for like a week about an idea, like I couldn't do any of these things. I just had this very simple system that was very closed off and that basically just worked when I told it to. So when my PhD was finished, I had an opportunity to relax for a bit, do some soul searching. I worked on some other projects like Damesh, which is a tool for analyzing generative systems. And I also built other versions of Angelina, which I won't talk about here, but they ended up being put on a hold. I wasn't happy with the directions they were going in. And so after a while, I sat down about a year and a half ago, and I thought, what do I actually want from a new version of this software? What would I actually want Angelina to look like next, with all the experience of the PhD behind me? And there were kind of 2 major phases I went through to solve those 4 problems I just mentioned. So first is the easy bit. 2 of the problems were actually solved using a very simple adjustment to what I was doing, which was basically to make things simpler. So before, we had this tightly bound system where, like I said, everything was wired together, everything was connected up, and it made it really hard to do lots of things. It made it hard to edit it, to maintain it. It made it hard for people to understand what it was doing. And so I just got rid of it. I got rid of the cooperative parallel aspect, and instead I broke Angelina down into these different tasks and made it a linear system that only did one of these tasks at a time. So instead of trying to do everything at once with this complex interrelated system, I just said, screw it, it doesn't matter. Just focus on one thing at a time. And this solved several problems. First of all, it was so much easier to engineer. It was such an easier concept for a system, and that meant that it was easier to build, and that I could make it complex in new ways, in more interesting ways, because I didn't have to tangle with this core that I didn't really like anymore. And the other thing was that it made it much easier for people to understand what was going on, because now Angelina was only ever doing one thing at a time. And so we could design these nice interfaces, which I'll show you a little bit more later. And these interfaces would show people what Angelina was doing, like it would show it designing rule sets, or it would show it playing levels, that kind of thing. And so we'd kind of taken out two birds with one stone. It was simpler for me to work with and build. It was simpler for people to understand. And obviously, I thought that cooperative coevolution was good for a reason, and I wrote my thesis on it even. And I think it is good, but I really appreciate having a simpler system concept so that we can build the complexity out in other ways. And hopefully you'll see how I've done that later on in this talk. I just thought I'd briefly show you what the interface kind of looked like. So this is the brand new interface for the new version of Angelina, and this is the level design phase, so you can see the level it's currently testing. At the bottom, it shows you the evolutionary level design system, the kinds of best levels it's seen so far. This is actually, as you can see, all the levels are the same. That's because it's just started playing in this screenshot, but you can get a feel for what's going on, and I'll show you some more screenshots later. But what about these thornier, kind of more mathematical, philosophical questions, rather? These were much harder to solve, and just to remind you what these were the fact that the system was very limited. It didn't have much control. It didn't have independence. It didn't really relate to the rest of the world. And also this problem of creative acts. It was really hard to get it to do different things, more things than just make games. And these all seemed really valid, and they also derive from these other problems where people were asking me questions about Angelina that I couldn't answer. And a lot of them related to things that we might consider was sort of anthropomorphizing the software. But I think it's important to look at the questions that people ask you about these systems, because it tells you a lot about their general perception of artificial intelligence. So people would ask me, can Angelina learn from famous game developers? Can it play famous games and learn from them? And the answer was no at the time, because technically that was just too difficult. The way that games work means that it's hard to plug one game into another if they use different engines or different platforms or whatever. And the software just wasn't there. How does Angelina decide to release a game? Well, it doesn't. It just finishes. The evolutionary system ends when I tell it to, and then it gives me the game. What is Angelina's favorite game? It doesn't really have any memory of its other games, and it doesn't compare them. It doesn't think about them. How many games has Angelina made? I included this question here because this seems more straightforward, but it's actually not. Angelina makes games while I am developing it. It makes games in testing. But Angelina doesn't kind of record those. They're considered throwaway games. I've probably thrown away 400 games made about Guardian newspaper articles. Only about 6 to 8 actually exist in a playable form online. So regardless of what you think about software and personification, these questions they come from a desire to know more about a system, to relate to it, to connect with it. And this is really important in computational creativity. It's important that we take these seriously and think about whether they have actual answers or whether they could have better answers. And so I was thinking about how do we answer these questions in a way that doesn't involve lying, that doesn't involve making stuff up? Are there ways to build a system that can sincerely answer them? And I began thinking about this very classic idea in computational creativity, which is process and product. So this is a person painting in a studio. When we talk about product, we mean the thing that is created, the output of the creative act. Sometimes we call it an artifact. So in this case, it's a painting. In Angelina's case, it's a video game. And the reason we make a distinction here is because in computational creativity, we talk a lot about the process. That's the thing that kind of sets our field apart. We're not just interested in what the algorithm did. We're interested in how it did it. And that aspect is one of the most interesting parts of our field. But as I thought about this while I was kind of sketching out this new version of Angelina, I realized that the circle I've drawn here, indicating the process, is actually incorrect. This bit down here is the process. The process is the act of painting. But this part of the picture is not in computational creativity. So when we talk about simulating the process, or talking about the process, or telling other people about the process. We really mean the act of painting, the skills that are used in the moment of painting. But there's so much more to being an artist or being a game designer than just painting. There's other things that happen besides just creative acts. And by building systems around creative outputs or creative acts, we kind of limit ourselves in the way we think about our systems and also the way other people can think about our systems. And so I want to introduce this third element to the product and process kind of way of thinking, which I've called presence, mostly to keep the PR symmetry going. But it's quite a good word for it, I think. And to give you a brief idea of what I mean by presence, product is a painting, if you like. So a product is the thing. It's brushstrokes on a canvas. And when we talk about process, we mean the act of painting. So that's the things that you use when you are actually doing the painting. So it's understanding. It's those things that we talk about all the time: skill, appreciation, knowledge. But then there's this third element that I'm calling presence, which is being a painter. That's not the painting itself. It's not the act of painting. It is being a painter day to day. It's learning from others, critiquing other people's work or your own. It's experimenting with new techniques or learning from new techniques from other people. Influencing those around you, making plans or having dreams, having goals that you want in your career. And presence is about the things that happen when you're not creating stuff. And it is super important to people's perception of a system. And it's also, I think, very important to us and how we build systems. It makes the systems more interesting to build. It allows us to do more things. And I'll show you how that's changed Angelina. And this is a really important point I want to make, is that once you begin to think about systems this way, artifacts, products, games, paintings, they become side effects of being creative. They are not the start and the end point of this software. They are things that happen while the software it just happens to be doing its thing. And for me, this has really helped in designing this new system. So I just want to talk briefly about how we can achieve presence and how I've achieved it. And there's more details in the paper, but the thing that I want to tell you today is that I learned that my system needed more space, basically. Because the way that we classically build creative processes, Kate Compton calls this the artist in a box. You press start, some art happens in your computer, and then you receive the art. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's fine. Like, it produces great systems. But it is limiting us in other ways. And so the fix that I came up with is to have this like linear art process that goes from start to art, and then you just cut off the end of that process and you just stretch it out so it goes on forever. There is no start or end to the creative process anymore, because if you're not doing it to create just one thing, there's no need for there to be a start or an end. The system can always be on, just like we are always on. A painter is never off. You know, they may not always be painting, but they are always a painter. And to give you an idea of what this might look like for a software, I've just realized Keynote has put these in reverse order, so I'll make them all appear now. But say on Tuesday morning, Angelina might design levels for a game that it's working on right now. But then on Tuesday afternoon, it might switch to a completely different thing. It might be prototyping new ideas for a game that it's planning to make next month. And then on Wednesday, it might just not do any work at all. It might instead play a game by a famous game designer to get some inspiration. And so this idea of thinking about creativity as a continuum, as something that is always happening, gives us a lot more freedom to build software that does lots of different things, that does things that complement one another. So playing a game by a famous game designer might make you a better designer. And this is what I call continuous creativity. So this is what Angelina looks like now. It has a database of projects, so these can be games, but they might be other things as well. They might be ideas or sketches or intentions to play other games. And it has a list of tasks that it can do, modules. And every project, every game project or whatever, has a to-do list of tasks that need to be done. And this to-do list is edited as time goes on. And Angelina just moves through this stack. It picks a game off its project database, it looks at the to-do list, it works on it for a little bit, and then maybe it puts it back, maybe it throws the game away, maybe it pauses it, maybe it publishes it to the web because it's finished. And it does this forever. It's constantly moving through these projects and picking apart them and using these self-contained, very flexible design modules. They can be used in, I mean, I don't want to go into the engineering details, but they can be used in many different ways, and Angelina can flexibly move between projects. So as I've said, continuous creativity means that the system has no start, it has no end, it just moves from task to task forever. If you switch Angelina off and then switch it back on again, it just picks up where it left off. And this also kind of means that we were able to just remove the notion of time limits, because Angelina isn't a Java program that has to finish in 4 to 6 hours. It can just take as long as it wants now. And actually, I want Angelina to take more time to make things. I want it to make games in a week or a month. Projects can be paused, they can be completely abandoned, they can be archived, they're very flexible things. They can be put down and kind of resurrected later. And as a side effect of all of these things, Angelina has to remember a lot more about what it's doing. It has to remember lots about its projects, it has to record lots of knowledge, and this turns out to be really good, and I've really doubled down on this for Angelina. Angelina records almost everything that happens to it. And the advantages of this continuous approach, recording more stuff means that we have more ammunition to frame the system's work, which is great. It's much more easy to mix different creative acts together now. It doesn't matter if you stop working on games for a day and go and do something like very low-level inventive work, or very high-level sketch work, or something unrelated like playing people's games. We can also now work on human timescales. So Angelina doesn't have to, cough out a game in a Sunday afternoon. It can take a long time, and what this means is that we can do things like have people anticipate a game. Angelina can announce a game that it is making, and people can look forward to its release, which is a very interesting creative relationship. It also means that Angelina can hire people. I'll talk about that in a sec. And it helps change my mindset as a developer of creative software, thinking about creativity as a lifetime process and not something that we do in bursts. So I have these slides just to show you what Angelina looks like today. So people can actually watch the system design live, which is really exciting. They can see the decisions that the software is making, which is a kind of framing of sorts. It's a sort of live, active framing. And you can also see aesthetic judgments or other decisions made. So at the bottom, I told you we have like the best levels that are in this level design evolution for it to, it displays them on the screen so people can see, oh, these are the kinds of levels that Angelina thinks are good at the moment, and then watch what Angelina's doing on the screen as well. And we also have these things in the top right-hand corner, which are chat. So Angelina is streaming its work on Twitch. It hasn't done it for a while, but it will be doing more of it in the future. And people can use simple chat commands to request information. So this is kind of a more interrogative style of framing that I want to experiment more with. And you should hear more about this from me in the future, probably at ICCC next year. So wrapping up now, future work, we want to collaborate with people. So Angelina can contract some art out on a Monday and then wait and get the art back on a Friday. We want Angelina to be super involved in that process, writing specifications, evaluating the work, budgeting. I'm looking at notions of progress for the system so it can assess whether it is working on a project properly or not, whether it's making progress, motivation for different decisions that it's going to make in this kind of project management phase. And we want to build in lots more creative tasks. So I want more invention, I want more discovery systems, this kind of thing. So that Angelina can spend days where it enriches its own capabilities and then uses that later to design games. One neat little thing to end on, earlier this year we were very, very fortunate to be invited by Rock Paper Shotgun to show Angelina at RESD, which is a very big games expo in the UK. About 20,000 people attend, I think, in London every year. And Angelina designed for 3 days live. We were on one machine where people could watch the system design games for all 3 days of the event. And on the machine next to it, you could play the games that Angelina had designed. It was a really lovely setup, and it was honestly one of the most rewarding things I've done in my research career so far, I think. I actually have a very limited supply of the postcards with me at the conference to give out. Sadly, you're watching on YouTube, so you can't have them. Sorry. So, Conclusions for the talk. Presence is a way of thinking about creative systems in a way that doesn't just focus on creating stuff. It's not about painting, it's about being a painter. It's not about game design, it's about being a designer. Continuously creative systems don't have a start, they don't have an end, they are always doing stuff, and they're much more flexible as a result and give us loads of new questions to ask. And building continuous systems that have presence is a great way forward for building creative systems, I think. And finally, sometimes it just feels really good to take 5 years of your work and think, I've learned from this and I'm going to move on and I'm going to refresh it, and that felt really good. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to find out more, you can always go to our research blog at gamesbyangelina.org. I'm hoping to redesign that in the future, so if you're watching this a year from now, that site might look a bit different, but hopefully there will be good stuff on there. And if you want to ask me any questions or chat, you can always leave a comment below, but I'm also on Twitter all the time at MTRC. Thanks very much for listening, and I will show you. I have another talk that I'm giving at ICCC, which I probably will record as well. It's a bit different, but that will go up probably this week as well. But yeah, I will see you in that one. Thanks very much.